Hello there. Thank you for being here tonight, for choosing this particular journey through time and mystery. Maybe it's late where you are, or maybe the day still hangs around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling to a place that exists both in ancient clay tablets and in the realm of unsettling questions. There are words pressed into Mesopotamian tablets, some of the oldest written words humanity possesses, that describe beings called the Anunnaki. And here's what's strange. These texts don't describe them as gods at all. They describe them as workers, as refugees, as beings who came to Earth, running from something. By the way, where are you listening from tonight? What does the evening feel like where you are? The Anunnaki appear in humanity's very first stories, the ones Sumerian scribes carved into wet clay 4,000 years ago. But the stories themselves, those might be far older, passed down through generations, through centuries of oral tradition, before anyone could write them down. And when you read these tablets carefully, when you look past the divine language and the religious interpretations added later, something else emerges. Not gods descending to rule, but survivors, desperate ones, mining the earth, building structures, gathering resources with an urgency that doesn't match the behavior of immortal beings with all of time at their disposal. They were working towards something, or preparing for something, or perhaps hiding from something that followed them here. If you enjoy these journeys into ancient mysteries, a like or subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this space find others who might need it, who lie awake wondering about the same questions that keep you company in the quiet hours. Thank you. Now settle in. Feel whatever's around you, the warmth, the weight of blankets, or the coolness of the room. Let your breath slow. There's no rush here. We're going to trace this mystery back to its source, to the cuneiform tablets themselves, to what they actually say when you read them without assumptions. We'll move slowly through the evidence, through the fragments and the patterns, through what archaeologists have found pressed into clay in the ruins of Uruk and Babylon and Nineveh. We'll look at creation myths that sound less like theology and more like reports, technical descriptions, accounts of engineering problems and labor disputes and desperate solutions. And we'll ask the question that emerges when you lay all these texts side by side. If the Anunnaki weren't gods, if they were flesh and blood beings who needed workers and resources and shelter, then what were they fleeing? What could terrify entities advanced enough to cross the heavens? What did they leave behind? And did it follow them here? The tablets don't give clear answers. They rarely do. But they give us fragments, clues, patterns that repeat across thousands of years of Mesopotamian writing, references to a destroyed planet, to a home they couldn't return to mining operations that sound more like survival efforts than conquests, to a flood that might have been less punishment and more erasure, an attempt to hide something, or to start over, or to eliminate evidence before something came looking. We may never know the full truth. The scribes who pressed these words into clay are 4 millennia gone, and they were already working from stories thousands of years old when they lived. But the tablets remain, sitting in museums now, in climate-controlled rooms, the cuneiform as sharp and clear as the day it was made, waiting, still asking us to read them, still suggesting that the story we've been told about gods and worship and divine kingship might be covering something else entirely. Something that begins not with creation, but with flight. Something that begins with beings who came to Earth not as masters, but as refugees who had nowhere else to go. So let's begin there, in the deep time before these tablets existed, in the world that was waiting all those thousands of years ago, when something arrived from the sky and started to dig into the earth as though their survival depended on it, because perhaps it did. Long before anyone pressed symbols into clay, long before cities had names or gods had faces, the land between two rivers moved through time in silence. This was Mesopotamia 12,000 years ago, but you wouldn't recognize it. The world was colder then, stranger, still shaking off the weight of ice that had pressed down on the northern hemisphere for 100,000 years. The glaciers were retreating, melting, releasing water that had been locked away since before any human could remember. Sea levels were rising, slowly at first, then faster. Coastlines that had existed for millennia were vanishing beneath waves. Islands were drowning. Land bridges were disappearing under the ocean. Imagine standing there in what would one day become Sumer. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed, but their courses were different then, wider, more chaotic. The Persian Gulf reached much farther inland, its waters lapping at places that are now desert, now archaeological sites buried under sand. The climate was wetter, the air smelled of marshland and grass. Where the Sahara spreads today, forests grew. Where desert now dominates the Middle East, grasslands rippled in winds that carried rain instead of dust. Take a breath here. There's no rush. The people who lived in this world were not farmers yet, not builders of cities. They moved with the seasons, following herds, gathering plants, living in small bands that left almost no trace. They had language, they had stories, they had knowledge passed down through generations about which plants healed and which rivers flooded and where the animals migrated when winter came. But they had no way to write any of it down. Everything they knew, everything they had learned over thousands of years, lived only in memory and in speech. And so when the world changed around them, as it was changing constantly in those centuries after the ice, the stories changed too, the accounts of what happened, the explanations for why the waters rose and the weather shifted and the familiar coastlines vanished. Perhaps that's when the first flood stories began, not as myth, but as memory. The memory of a world that had been one way and then suddenly, catastrophically, became another. We forget how recent this is. 12,000 years sounds like an eternity, but the universe is 13 billion years old. The Earth is 4.5 billion. Modern humans, anatomically identical to us, have existed for 300,000 years, and for most of that time, for 97% of human history, we lived exactly like those people in ancient Mesopotamia. No cities, no writing, no permanent structures, just stories and stars and the slow turning of seasons. Then something shifted. Around 10,000 years ago, in several places across the world almost simultaneously, people began to settle, to plant seeds deliberately, instead of just gathering what grew wild, to domesticate animals, to build structures meant to last more than a season. In Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent, this transition happened remarkably fast. Within a few thousand years, permanent villages appeared, then towns, then something approaching cities. The question is, why then? Why, after 300,000 years of living one way, did humanity suddenly, in the span of a few millennia, completely transform how it existed in the world? Some say it was climate stabilization. The warming world created conditions where agriculture became possible. Others point to population pressure, to the need to feed more people in smaller territories. Still others wonder if there was something else, some catalyst, some introduction of knowledge or technology, or, as the ancient tablets would later claim, some intervention from beings who arrived and taught. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just picture that world, the Mesopotamian valley, green and wet and wild, the sky above it unchanged, the same constellations humans had watched for 100,000 years, the same stars that had guided migrations and marked seasons and inspired the first attempts to make sense of the cosmos. The stars were patient. They had time. They had seen worlds rise and fall, had watched species emerge and vanish, had shone down on a planet that had already gone through 5 mass extinctions before humans ever walked. And somewhere in that sky, according to the tablets that would be written thousands of years later, something was moving, something was traveling, something was searching for a refuge. The people below didn't know it yet. They were still learning to plant barley in straight rows, still figuring out how to store grain through the winter, still experimenting with mud brick and reed architecture. They were still telling stories around fires at night, stories about spirits in the rivers and forces in the storms and ancestors who remembered when the world was different. They didn't know that soon, very soon, on the timescale of geological patience, those stories would expand, would grow stranger, would begin to include beings who came from the sky with tools and knowledge and needs that would change everything. The stage was set. The land was ready. The ice had retreated. The rivers flowed. The soil was rich. And something, somewhere above, was descending. When the first permanent settlements appeared in Mesopotamia, when people began to cluster in villages along the riverbanks, instead of wandering, something else was happening that the archaeological record struggles to explain. The transition was too fast. One moment, relatively speaking, humans were living in small groups, using stone tools, gathering and hunting as they had for hundreds of thousands of years. Then, within what amounts to a blink in geological time, a few thousand years at most, those same humans were building complex irrigation systems, developing mathematics, tracking astronomical cycles, creating the foundations of writing, establishing social hierarchies, constructing monumental architecture. It's not that humans weren't capable of these things. Clearly we were. The brain that built the first ziggurat was the same brain that had tracked mammoth migrations through Ice Age Europe. But the speed of the change, that's what raises questions. That's what makes archaeologists uncomfortable when they look at the timeline. That's what the ancient tablets, when they were finally written, attempted to explain. They said the knowledge came from the sky. Picture Mesopotamia, 7,000 years ago. The villages were growing into towns now. Uruk, which would become one of humanity's first great cities, was already a thriving settlement. Eridu, which the Sumerians believed was the oldest city on Earth, sat near the marshlands, where the two rivers met. These weren't primitive camps. They were organized communities with specialized workers, with potters and weavers, and the earliest priests, with granaries and workshops and central buildings that served purposes we still debate. The people here didn't call themselves Sumerians yet. That name would come later from someone else's language. They simply called their land the civilized land, the place where order existed, where chaos had been pushed back, and they told stories, passed down orally, about how that civilization had begun. They said the knowledge came from the Abzu, from the water, from beings who emerged from the Persian Gulf and walked onto land and began to teach. They said these beings, the Anunnaki, brought the arts of agriculture and writing and astronomy. They said humans had been wild before, eating grass like sheep, living without purpose or direction. And then the sky people came, and everything changed. Maybe it's metaphor, maybe it's symbolic, maybe it's ancient people trying to make sense of their own rapid development by attributing it to divine intervention. Every culture does this, creates myths to explain transitions they don't understand. But maybe, if you read the tablets carefully, they're describing something that actually happened. The Sumerians were obsessive record keepers. Once they developed writing around 3400 BCE, they used it for everything. Grain inventories, legal contracts, property disputes, lists of kings and their reigns, and mixed in with all that mundane documentation, religious texts, creation stories, accounts of the gods or of beings they called gods who had been present at the beginning. And those accounts are specific, too specific to be purely mythological. They described the Anunnaki as physical beings who needed food and shelter and rest, who complained about working conditions, who argued among themselves about resource allocation and labor management, who used tools and vehicles described in technical terms that sound unsettlingly like technology. When the first cities rose, when Uruk and Eridu began to dominate the landscape, their central features weren't palaces, they were ziggurats, step pyramids that reached toward the sky, and the tablets described these not as places of worship primarily, but as landing platforms, as bonds between heaven and earth, as places where the sky people could descend and ascend. The ruins of these ziggurats still exist. You can visit them today, stand at the base and look up at the massive brick structures. Imagine them when they were intact, when they had smooth sides and temples at their peaks. Imagine them at night, under the same stars that shine now, waiting. For what? The tablets say the Anunnaki came and went, that they didn't stay continuously on Earth, that they had a home elsewhere, a place they called Nibiru, a planet that crossed the heavens on a long orbit, that they arrived periodically, stayed for generations, then departed again. And during their time on Earth, they needed workers, they needed resources, they needed, according to the texts, gold, enormous amounts of gold, mined from deep in the earth, processed and sent somewhere. Take a breath, let that settle. The Sumerians didn't mine much gold themselves. It wasn't abundant in Mesopotamia, but their texts obsess over it. They describe the Anunnaki mining it in a place called the Abzu, which some scholars identify as southern Africa, based on geographical descriptions in the texts. They describe mining operations lasting thousands of years. They describe the Anunnaki workers, the lesser ones called the Igigi, growing tired, refusing to continue, burning their tools in rebellion, and they describe the solution: create substitute workers, create humans, mixing the clay of the earth with the blood of the gods, fashioning beings capable of bearing the burden the Anunnaki no longer wish to carry. This is in the oldest text we have. This is what the Sumerians wrote down as soon as they could write anything down. Not metaphor about divine creation, but procedural accounts of genetic engineering, of mixing materials, of failed attempts and successful ones, of beings called Adamu, those made from earth, who were created to serve. The landscape was changing. The marshlands were being drained for agriculture. The first canals were being dug. The first farms were spreading out from the river valleys, and according to the tablets, humans were doing that work, not as free people discovering agriculture naturally, but as workers following instructions from beings who already knew how civilization was built, because they'd built it before, somewhere else, before they came here, before something made them leave. Around 3400 BCE, something remarkable happened in the city of Uruk. Someone, we'll never know who, pressed a reed stylus into soft clay and made marks that represented words, not pictures exactly, though they started that way. Not just symbols for objects, but symbols for sounds, for ideas, for abstract concepts that couldn't be drawn, the birth of writing. The moment when human thought became permanent, when memory could exist outside of living minds, when stories could survive the death of the storyteller. The early tablets are practical, boring, honestly. Lists of grain, tallies of sheep, records of who owned what, who owed what, how many jars of oil were stored in which warehouse, the infrastructure of civilization captured in clay. But within a few hundred years, once the scribes got comfortable with the technology, they began writing other things. They began writing down the old stories, the ones that had been passed down orally for how long? 1,000 years? 5,000? 10? The stories about the beginning, about the gods who had walked the earth, about the Anunnaki, and that's when things get interesting. The earliest religious texts we have, the ones from around 2500 BCE, don't read like mythology. They read like reports, technical manuals, historical accounts trying to preserve information about events that had already become ancient. The tone is matter of fact. These beings arrived. They did these things. They organized in these ways. They created this hierarchy. They built these structures. They needed these resources. When archaeologists first translated these tablets in the 1800s, when they finally cracked cuneiform and could read what the Sumerians had written, they assumed they were reading pure mythology, creation stories, religious texts explaining the world through the lens of gods and divine intervention, and they filed them away under ancient religion alongside Greek myths and Egyptian cosmology, and every other culture's attempts to explain existence through supernatural beings. But if you read them now, with modern eyes, with an understanding of technology and engineering and genetic manipulation, they sound different. They sound like something else entirely. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which most people know only for its flood story, contains detailed accounts of Uruk's founding, of its walls, whose dimensions are given precisely, of its temples and gardens, and it describes Gilgamesh himself as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, not metaphorically. The text treats this as a literal genetic ratio. His mother was a goddess, Ninsun, one of the Anunnaki. His father was human, and this hybrid status gave Gilgamesh exceptional strength, exceptional longevity, exceptional abilities that normal humans didn't possess. The tablets describe this hybridization as commonplace in the early days. Kings claimed descent from the Anunnaki, priests claimed it, entire bloodlines were supposedly mixed, part human, part something else. And these hybrid lines ruled, they built, they led, they preserved knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human discovery. The Sumerian king list, discovered on multiple tablets from different cities, all telling the same story, begins with a striking phrase: when kingship was lowered from heaven. Not metaphorical heaven. The tablets describe an actual location above. From there, kingship descended, and the first kings, according to the list, ruled for impossibly long periods. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, Alalgar for 36,000 years. These aren't symbolic numbers. The scribes recorded them the same way they recorded grain tallies, as factual information. Then the list says something extraordinary. The flood swept over. After the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven once more. A reset, a break in continuity. Something catastrophic that ended one era and began another. And after that flood, the reign lengths become more normal, more human. A few hundred years, a few decades. Eventually, lifespans that match our own. What happened? What changed? The tablets from Nippur, from Babylon, from a dozen different Mesopotamian cities, all tell variations of the same story. The Anunnaki had a council, 7 who decree the fates, 50 who advise, 300 assigned to heaven, 600 assigned to earth. These aren't vague mythological numbers, they're specific, organizational, like reading a corporate structure or a military hierarchy, and they describe what these beings did. Enki, called Lord of Earth, was assigned to the Abzu, to the waters, to the deep places where gold was mined. Enlil, Lord of the Command, ruled from Nippur, the religious center, the place where heaven and earth met. Inanna, later called Ishtar, was given cities and trade routes. Utu, the sun god, handled justice and law. These weren't distant cosmic forces, they were administrators, managers, beings with specific jobs, specific territories, specific responsibilities. And they argued. Oh, how they argued. The tablets are full of disputes between Enki and Enlil about humanity, about resources, about whether humans should be educated or kept ignorant, about whether to save humanity from the flood or let it perish. Pause for a moment. Breathe. When archaeologists excavated Uruk, when they dug through layer after layer of ancient occupation, they found the oldest levels contained temples to Anu and Inanna, not palaces. not fortifications, temples, massive ones, built with precision that shouldn't have existed yet, using mathematical principles that wouldn't be discovered for thousands of years, aligned to astronomical events with accuracy that required generations of careful observation, or, if you believe the tablets, aligned by beings who already knew, who had watched the stars from elsewhere, who had travelled by them, who understood orbital mechanics and planetary cycles because they had crossed that space themselves. The tablets were written to remember, the scribes who pressed these symbols into clay, who carefully copied texts from earlier tablets, who preserved these stories through wars and floods and the rise and fall of empires. They believed they were recording history, not inventing religion, not creating mythology, recording what had happened, what their ancestors had witnessed, what had been passed down through enough generations that the details were fuzzy, but the core remained. Beings came from the sky, they settled in Mesopotamia, they built the first cities, they taught the first arts, they created workers from the clay of the earth, they ruled for thousands of years, they departed, and they left behind these stories, pressed into clay, waiting in the darkness beneath Mesopotamian sand, for someone to dig them up and read them and wonder, what if they weren't gods at all? What if they were just people, advanced people, desperate people, refugee people who needed somewhere to go, and Earth was empty enough, primitive enough, safe enough to hide? The next question forms naturally. Hide from what? When archaeologists began excavating ancient Mesopotamian sites in the 1800s, when they first started pulling tablets from the ruins of Nippur and Babylon and Ur, they expected to find religious texts, prayers, hymns, the usual contents of ancient temples. What they found instead were lists of kings, detailed, meticulous, bureaucratic lists, recording who ruled when, for how long, in which city. The Sumerians, it turned out, were obsessed with documentation. They wanted everything written down, everything preserved, everything remembered exactly as it happened. The problem was, when scholars finally translated these king lists, they didn't make sense. The Sumerian king list appears on multiple tablets from different cities, all telling the same story with slight variations. It begins with the phrase, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Not a metaphor, not poetic language. A statement of fact presented the same way the rest of the list presents facts. Kingship came from above. It landed in Eridu, the oldest city, and the first king, Alulim, ruled from there. For 28,800 years, the second king, Al-Algar, ruled for 36,000 years, the third, Ameluanar, for 43,200 years. On and on, 8 kings in Eridu alone, reigning for a combined total of 241,200 years. Then the kingship moved to Bad Tabira, and 5 more kings ruled there for 108,000 years. Then to Larak, to Sippar, to Shuruppak, each city hosting kings whose lifespans stretched across millennia. And then, the list says simply, the flood swept over. After the flood, everything changes. The kingship descends from heaven again, but this time the reign lengths are different. Still long by our standards, but human scale. A few hundred years, a few decades. Eventually, by the time we reach kings whose reigns can be verified by other sources, the numbers match what we'd expect. 30 years, 20 years, lifespans that make sense. Scholars have struggled with this for over a century. The obvious explanation is that it's mythology, symbolic. The long reigns represent dynasties, not individuals, or they're meant to show the great antiquity and legitimacy of kingship, or they're simply made-up priestly inventions to connect human rulers to divine origins. But the Sumerians didn't treat them that way. They recorded these kings in the same lists, using the same language, with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for kings whose reigns we can verify historically. There's no stylistic shift, no indication that the early part is mythological, while the later part is historical. It's all presented as history, as things that actually happened, and the flood is treated the same way. Not as divine punishment, not as myth, as a historical event that reset everything, that divided time into before and after, that marked a break so complete, so catastrophic, that civilization had to begin again from scratch. Perhaps it's exaggeration. Perhaps kings who ruled for 30 years became 30,000 in the retelling, the numbers inflating as the stories passed through generations. Perhaps. But what if the numbers mean something else? What if the Sumerians were trying to record something that didn't fit their normal categories, using the only framework they had, and we're misunderstanding what they meant? The tablets also list the Me, pronounced May, the divine powers or attributes that the Anunnaki possessed, not abstract qualities. The MEE were described as objects, physical things that could be stolen, lost, transferred from one god to another. Inanna steals the ME from Enki. In one famous story, getting him drunk and taking them while he's incapacitated, and with the ME she gains power over civilization itself, the ability to build cities, to establish laws, to create art and music and writing. These sound less like divine attributes, and more like devices, technology, knowledge stored in physical form, and whoever possessed the ME controlled the advancement of civilization. Take a breath here, there's no rush. The king list appears on tablets dating from around 2000 BCE, but the events it describes, if they're historical at all, would have occurred thousands of years earlier. The Sumerians were recording their own deep past, and they did it with remarkable consistency. Every city had its copy of the king list. Every temple preserved the same sequence of rulers, the same impossibly long reigns, the same flood marking the transition from one age to another. Modern archaeology has found evidence of massive flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE. Layers of river sediment in the ruins of Ur and Uruk and other cities, marking a catastrophic inundation that covered the entire region. Not a global flood, but devastating enough to seem apocalyptic to anyone who experienced it. Enough to divide history into before and after. Enough to become the flood story that appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and later in the Hebrew Bible, and in flood myths from dozens of other cultures around the world. But the king list describes the flood as happening after hundreds of thousands of years of civilization, after 8 kings had ruled in Eridu alone. If that timeline is even remotely accurate, if there's any kernel of historical truth in those impossible numbers, then the flood wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the middle, maybe even the end. The beginning, according to the tablets, was when the Anunnaki arrived, when they established Eridu as the first city, when they began the work of mining and building and organizing the earth, when they created human workers to help bear the burden of that work. And the flood, according to those same tablets, was deliberate, sent by Enlil, meant to destroy humanity, to wipe the slate clean, to eliminate evidence or mistakes or something that had gone wrong with the Anunnaki's experiment in creating a worker species. The king list doesn't explain why, it just records. Flood came, everything ended, everything began again, and the kingship, once more, descended from heaven to start anew. The same stars that had shone over the first kings, over Alulim, in Eridu, over the long ages before the flood, those stars still shine. They've barely shifted in 5,000 years, much less in the vast timeframes the tablets describe. The constellations the Sumerians named, Taurus and Leo and Scorpio, still wheel overhead, still mark the seasons, still guide travelers and mark time. And somewhere in the clay beneath Mesopotamian soil, more tablets wait, more king lists, more fragments of the story, more pieces of whatever truth the Sumerians were trying so desperately to preserve. We keep digging, we keep translating, we keep finding variations and confirmations and new questions, and the numbers, those impossible, disturbing numbers, remain unchanged in every version. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Either they mean nothing, or they mean everything. In December of 1848, a young British explorer named Austen Henry Layard was excavating the ancient city of Nineveh in what is now Iraq. He'd been digging there for years, uncovering the palace of King Ashurbanipal, finding room after room filled with artifacts from the Assyrian Empire. But on this particular day, his workers uncovered something extraordinary, a library, an entire library preserved in clay. The room was filled with tablets, thousands of them, stacked on shelves that had long since rotted away, so the tablets had fallen and shattered and mixed together over the centuries, but they were still readable, still intact enough that the cuneiform pressed into them remained sharp and clear. The library of Ashurbanipal, one of the last great Assyrian kings, who had ordered his scribes to collect and copy every important text from across Mesopotamia. It took decades to catalogue everything, to piece together broken fragments, to translate the ancient Akkadian and Sumerian languages, and in 1876, a scholar named George Smith announced that he'd reconstructed something remarkable from the fragments, a creation story, 7 tablets that told how the world began, how the gods emerged from primordial chaos, how the universe was organized, how humans came to be. The Babylonians called it a Numa Elish, when on high, the opening words of the text, and when scholars finally read it all the way through, when they understood what it was describing, they realized it didn't sound like other creation myths. It sounded like something else, something stranger. The story begins in a time before time, when nothing existed except Apsu, the fresh waters, and Tiamat, the salt waters, mingling together in the void. From their union came the first gods, Lamu and Lahamu, then Anshar and Kishar, then Anu, then Ea, who the Sumerians called Enki. So far, so mythological. Standard creation story stuff, cosmic forces personified as deities, the universe emerging from primordial waters. Every culture has some version of this, but then it gets specific. Too specific. The younger gods are noisy. They disturb Apsu's rest. He complains to Tiamat, "Their ways have become burdensome to me. By day I have no rest. By night I cannot sleep." He decides to destroy them, but Ea, clever Ea, learns of the plan and acts first. He puts Apsu into a deep sleep and kills him, takes his power, claims his dwelling as his own. Tiamat is enraged. She creates an army of monsters to avenge Apsu. 11 types of creatures, each described in detail, serpents and dragons and scorpion men. She appoints Kingu as her champion, gives him the Tablet of Destinies, the ME that control fate itself. The younger gods are terrified. None of them can face Tiamat's army, except Marduk. Young, ambitious, powerful Marduk, son of Ea. He agrees to fight Tiamat, but only if the gods grant him supreme authority over all of them. They agree. They have no choice. So Marduk arms himself with winds and lightning and a net made of sky. He confronts Tiamat in battle, and this is where it stops sounding like mythology and starts sounding like something else. Marduk defeats Tiamat, but instead of just killing her, he tears her body apart. He splits her like a shellfish into 2 parts. Half of her body he sets up as the sky, the other half becomes the earth. From her eyes, the Tigris and Euphrates flow. From her tail, the Milky Way stretches across the heavens. From her ribs, the vault of heaven is formed. Take a breath. Let that settle. This isn't metaphorical creation from thought or word, like in many religious traditions. This is physical, mechanical. The universe created from the body of a destroyed planet. Earth formed from the remains of something that was torn apart in cosmic violence. Modern astronomy tells us that our solar system formed from a debris disk around the young sun, that planets coalesced from dust and gas, that collisions between protoplanets were common in the early solar system, that Earth itself may have been struck by a Mars-sized object called Theia, and from that collision, the Moon was born. The Enuma Elish describes something remarkably similar, a massive collision, a planetary body destroyed, the pieces forming the structure of the solar system we know, written in clay 4,000 years ago by people who supposedly had no telescopes, no space probes, no way to know how solar systems actually form, unless someone told them, unless someone who had seen it, or studied it, or come from somewhere else where this knowledge was common, explained it to them. And the Babylonian scribes wrote it down, dressed it in the language of gods and monsters, because that was the framework they had, but preserving the essential details underneath. After Marduk defeats Tiamat, after he reorganizes the cosmos, the gods celebrate, but they still have a problem. They're tired of working, mining, building, maintaining the infrastructure of heaven and earth. So Marduk proposes a solution. He'll create something new. Workers, beings made from the earth, mixed with the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's defeated champion. I will create Lulu, man will be his name, Marduk declares. He will be charged with the service of the gods, that they might have ease. Not poetic, not metaphorical. Humans created specifically to work, to serve, to bear burdens the gods no longer wish to carry, and created from a mixture of earth and divine blood, the same genetic mixing described in the Atrahasis epic, the same hybrid origin claimed by Sumerian kings. The Enuma Elish was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years. It was recited every year in Babylon during the New Year festival. It was considered sacred, essential, the foundation story that explained not just religious belief but the actual physical structure of reality. And buried in its 7 tablets, beneath the language of gods and cosmic battles, is a description of planetary formation, of genetic engineering, of a workforce created to serve beings who came from somewhere else and needed help surviving in their new home. The tablets rest in museums now, in London, in Baghdad, in collections around the world. You can go see them if you want. Stand before the glass cases and look at the clay, still marked with cuneiform, still telling the story George Smith translated in 1876, still asking us to decide, is this mythology, or is it memory dressed in the only language available of something that actually happened? The scholars continue to debate, the translations continue to be refined, and the story remains, patient as the clay that holds it, waiting for us to understand. There's another text, older than the Enuma Elish, more direct, less wrapped in cosmic poetry, and more focused on the practical problem that led to humanity's creation. It's called the Atrahasis Epic, and it reads, disturbingly, like a labor dispute that got out of hand. The story begins 40 years after the Anunnaki arrived on Earth, not in mythological time, but in years counted and recorded. 40 years of work, 40 years of digging, mining, excavating, building infrastructure, and the Anunnaki workers, the lower-ranking ones, the Agigi, have had enough. The toil is too great, they complain, the distress too much. They weren't gods in the sense we usually mean. They were workers, laborers, beings who could be exhausted, who could suffer, who could rebel when conditions became unbearable. And so they did. They burned their tools. They marched to the dwelling of Enlil, the commander, the one in charge. They surrounded his house at night, and Enlil, described as the supreme leader of the Anunnaki on Earth, was terrified. He thought they'd come to kill him. A council was called, the 7 great Anunnaki who made the decisions. Anu, the distant leader from the sky. Enlil, ruler of Earth. Enki, lord of the Abzu and the deep places, and others. They debated what to do. The Agigi refused to return to work. The mining had to continue, but the workers were in open rebellion. Enki, always Enki the clever one, proposed a solution: create substitute workers, being strong enough to bear the physical labor, but simple enough to be controlled. Take the clay of the earth, mix it with something from the Anunnaki themselves, and fashion creatures who could do the work the Agigi refused. The text is specific about how this was done. A god was sacrificed, one of the rebels, and his blood was mixed with clay. The goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag, the birth goddess, shaped the mixture. Not once, but multiple times. There were failed attempts, creatures that didn't survive, creatures that couldn't reproduce, creatures that were sterile or deformed or unable to work. Finally, after trial and error, success. The creature called Lulu, or Adamu, the one made from earth, created specifically to work, created to dig the irrigation canals, to plant the fields, to carry the burdens the Anunnaki no longer wished to carry. And at first, there were only a few, 7 male and 7 female, according to some versions, created by Nintu, brought to life through some process the tablets describe but we don't fully understand. They call it giving the breath of life, mixing the clay with divine blood and adding something that made it alive, something that made it conscious. Maybe it's pure mythology, ancient people trying to explain their own existence through stories of gods and creation. Every culture has these stories, everyone wonders where we came from, but the Atrahasis epic doesn't read like other creation myths. It's not cosmic, it's not grand, it's a problem-solving story, a technical report about a labor shortage and how it was resolved through the creation of a new workforce. The tone is matter of fact, almost bureaucratic. These were the conditions, this was the problem, this was the solution, these were the results, and the results were complicated. Humans multiplied quickly, too quickly. Within a few generations, according to the text, they were everywhere, making noise, consuming resources, becoming difficult to control. Enlil, who had never liked the idea of creating humans in the first place, became increasingly disturbed by their numbers. He tried to reduce the population, first through disease, then through drought, then through famine. Each time, Enki intervened, teaching humans how to survive, sharing knowledge of medicine, agriculture, irrigation, protecting his creations from Enlil's attempts to eliminate them. Finally, Enlil had enough. He decided on a final solution, a flood, a deluge that would wipe the earth clean, destroy all of humanity, and allow the Anunnaki to start over, or perhaps to leave without the complications humans had created. But Enki, always the rebel, always the one who sided with humans over his own kind, warned one man, Atrahasis, the extremely wise one. He told him to build a boat, gave him exact dimensions, exact specifications, told him to seal it with bitumen, to load it with animals and supplies, to prepare for waters that would cover the earth. And when the flood came, when the Anunnaki retreated to the sky to escape the devastation they'd unleashed, Atrahasis and his family survived. Along with the animals, along with enough to rebuild, the story would be retold many times, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Atrahasis becomes Utnapishtim, in the Hebrew Bible, where he becomes Noah. In flood myths from cultures around the world, each with their own variations, but all sharing the same core, a catastrophic deluge, a warning from a divine figure, a man who built a boat and saved humanity from extinction. But in the original Atrahasis epic, the flood isn't divine judgment for human sin. It's not about punishment for wickedness. It's about population control, about eliminating evidence, about ending an experiment that had gone wrong, and the hero survives not because he was righteous, but because one of the Anunnaki, Enki, chose to defy the consensus and save him when the waters receded, when Atrahasis made his offering to the gods, when the Anunnaki descended and smelled the smoke and realized that humans had survived. Enlil was furious. He raged at Enki, demanded to know how humans had escaped the destruction meant to annihilate them, and Enki, in one of the most remarkable moments in all of Mesopotamian literature, essentially shrugged. He didn't directly admit his role, but he defended humanity's right to exist, argued that they were needed, that destroying them was wasteful, that instead of annihilation, there should be balance, control, management. Take a breath. Rest here for a moment. The Atrahasis epic was written on tablets dating from around 1700 BCE, but the story it tells, like the King List, like the Enuma Elish, reaches back to a much older oral tradition. Scholars estimate these stories may have circulated for 1,000 years or more before anyone wrote them down, and what's striking is the consistency. Different cities, different scribes, different time periods, but the same basic story. Humans created as workers, Anunnaki divided over whether humanity should exist, a flood meant to destroy, a survival against the odds, a new beginning with new terms. It's preserved in clay, brittle, fragile clay that somehow survived 4,000 years, through wars and invasions and the complete collapse of Mesopotamian civilization, through the rise of Persia and Greece and Rome and Islam and modernity. Through all of that, the tablets endured. Still asking the question they've always asked, what if this isn't mythology? What if the Sumerians were recording actual history as accurately as they could, with the understanding they had? What if humans really were created, deliberately, by beings who needed workers and had the knowledge to make them? And what if those beings, the Anunnaki, were themselves refugees, survivors of something that forced them to Earth, desperately gathering resources, building infrastructure, preparing for what? The tablets don't give final answers, they rarely do, but they offer fragments, patterns, pieces that might fit together into something coherent, if we're willing to consider possibilities that don't match our assumptions about ancient ignorance and modern sophistication. The clay waits, patient, unchanged, holding its secrets as it has for millennia, and we continue to read and wonder and ask. At the center of nearly every Mesopotamian text, at the heart of every story about the Anunnaki and their relationship with humanity, stands a conflict between two brothers, not brothers by blood necessarily. The tablets are unclear about exact family relationships, but brothers in authority, in power, in their roles as leaders of the Anunnaki presence on Earth. Enki, lord of the Abzu, lord of the deep waters and the hidden places, and Enlil, lord of the command, ruler of the air and the surface, the one who held supreme authority. They disagreed about nearly everything, and those disagreements shaped the entire story of early civilization. Enki is described consistently across thousands of years of texts as humanity's friend, our teacher, the one who shared knowledge that was supposed to remain secret. In the Sumerian poems, he's portrayed as clever, rebellious, willing to defy the consensus of other Anunnaki leaders if he believed they were wrong. He taught humans agriculture when they were supposed to remain hunter-gatherers. He taught them mathematics when they were supposed to be simple laborers. He taught them writing, astronomy, medicine, engineering. He gave them the ME, those mysterious objects or devices that contain the arts of civilization, not all at once, but gradually, teaching them how to build cities, how to establish laws, how to create art and music and literature. He wanted humans to rise, to become more than workers, to approach the level of their creators. Enlil, by contrast, is portrayed as strict, distant, concerned with order and hierarchy. He believed humans should remain in their place, that they were created for a purpose, to work, to serve, and teaching them too much, allowing them to become too numerous, too knowledgeable, would lead to problems, to chaos, to a loss of control. And he was right, in a sense. Humans did become numerous, did become knowledgeable, did begin to question their role. The tablets describe Enlil's growing frustration as human cities spread across Mesopotamia, as populations exploded, as the noise of human civilization disturbed his rest. The land has grown numerous, the noise is intolerable, sleep is no longer possible. That's Enlil's complaint in the Atrahasis epic, not a metaphor. He's literally disturbed by how many humans there are, by how loud they've become, by how they've filled the land that was supposed to be under Anunnaki control. Imagine the dynamic. Two powerful beings, both commanding respect, both holding authority over different domains. Enki in the waters, the underground, the mysterious Abzu where mining operations continued, Enlil on the surface, in Nippur, the religious center, the place where decrees were issued and cosmic order was maintained, and between them, humanity, caught between a patron who wanted them to grow and a ruler who wanted them controlled, between a teacher who shared forbidden knowledge and a commander who saw that knowledge as dangerous. The conflict wasn't abstract. It played out in specific incidents recorded in the tablets. When Enlil sent disease to reduce human populations, Enki taught humans medicine. When Enlil caused drought, Enki showed humans how to dig deeper wells, how to build irrigation canals. When Enlil withheld rain, Enki revealed the secrets of the weather, taught humans to predict seasons, to store grain against lean years. Every attempt at control was met with an act of education. Every restriction was undermined by shared knowledge, until finally Enlil proposed the flood, the ultimate solution. Wipe the earth clean, start over. Or perhaps simply eliminate the complication and move on. The tablets suggest the Anunnaki were preparing to leave anyway, that their work on Earth was nearing completion, that they had gathered what they needed, and humans, having served their purpose, could be disposed of. But Enki refused to accept that outcome. He warned Atrahasis, gave him instructions to build the boat, saved humanity from annihilation, and in doing so, committed what the other Anunnaki saw as the ultimate betrayal. The flood story in Mesopotamian texts isn't about sin and redemption. It's about a power struggle between two leaders, with fundamentally different views about what humanity should be allowed to become. And Enki won, in the sense that humans survived, but Enlil won too, in the sense that after the flood, the rules changed. Humans would be allowed to continue, but under different conditions, with limitations, with mortality firmly established, with the hybrid bloodlines, the human Anunnaki mixings, brought to an end. Take a breath here. There's no rush. The ruins of Nippur, Enlil's city, still exist in Iraq. You can visit the site, walk among the broken walls, see the outlines of the ancient ziggurat where Enlil's temple once stood. The city was occupied for thousands of years. Generation after generation of scribes copied tablets there, preserved the stories, maintained the records. And in those records, Enlil is never portrayed as evil, just as stern, as concerned with order, as believing that hierarchy must be maintained, that workers must remain workers, that the natural order of things shouldn't be disrupted by beings who were created to serve suddenly demanding equality, or freedom, or knowledge. Enki's city was Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition, and there, the tone of the texts is different. Enki is praised as wise, as generous, as the one who loves humanity, the one who shares secrets, the one who can be approached, bargained with, convinced to help. Two cities, two temples, two very different relationships with the divine, and between them, the entirety of Sumerian civilization navigating the tension, honoring both, praying to both, never quite sure which one's favor mattered more. The conflict didn't end with the flood. It continued in the texts that describe the post-Diluvian world. Enlil still ruled, still issued commands from Nippur, but Enki still operated in the shadows, still helped humanity when he could, still shared knowledge that was supposed to remain hidden. And perhaps that's why the Sumerians developed so quickly after the flood, why their civilization rebounded not just to previous levels but beyond them, why mathematics and astronomy and engineering suddenly blossomed in ways that surprised even modern scholars looking at the timeline. Because Enki was still teaching, still sharing, still defying the restrictions Enlil wanted to impose. The tablets preserve this tension. The prayers invoke both names. The kings claimed descent from both lineages. The cities honored both temples. Ancient Mesopotamia existed in the space between two opposing visions, two opposing authorities, two opposing ideas about what humanity could or should become. And we're still living in that space, still caught between voices that say know your place and voices that say you can become more, still navigating between authority that demands obedience and wisdom that offers liberation, still wondering which voice to trust, which path to follow, which vision of humanity's future is the right one. The clay tablets don't resolve the conflict. They can't, because the conflict is eternal. It's built into the structure of the story, into the nature of the beings involved, into the fundamental question of what humans are for and what we're allowed to become. Enki and Enlil, the teacher and the ruler, the rebel and the authority, the one who wants us to rise and the one who wants us controlled, and somewhere between them, in the space their disagreement created, civilization emerged. When you read the Mesopotamian tablets carefully, when you strip away the assumption that everything ancient people wrote about gods must be metaphorical, something interesting emerges. The descriptions start to sound technical, specific, like reports of actual objects and actual capabilities, rather than mythological powers. Take the MEE, those mysterious objects the tablets mention constantly. They're not abstract concepts. They're things that can be held, stolen, transferred from one god to another. In the story of Inanna and Enki, the goddess gets Enki drunk and steals over 100 ME from him. The text lists them: the ME of kingship, the ME of writing, the ME of metalworking, the ME of warfare, on. And when Enki sobers up and realizes what happened, he doesn't just accept it. He sends his servants to retrieve the ME before Inanna can reach her city of Uruk. There's a chase, a confrontation. The ME are described as needing to be transported, protected, kept safe from damage. These aren't metaphorical powers. These are devices, objects containing information or capabilities that could be physically moved from place to place. Modern translators struggle with this. They usually render me as divine attributes or cosmic powers, but that's interpretation, not translation. The Sumerian word doesn't quite match those concepts. It's more like units, modules, things that could be possessed, used, transferred. And whoever held the ME relevant to a particular art or science held the power to practice that art or science. It sounds like technology, like data storage, like devices containing knowledge or capabilities that could be given, taken, lost, found. The texts describe other objects too, the brilliance that certain gods possessed, not metaphorical divine radiance, actual light that could be worn or carried, light bright enough to illuminate the night, light that emanated from objects the Anunnaki wore on their bodies. Inanna is described as being surrounded by this brilliance. So is Marduk, so are several others, and when they appeared to humans at night, the tablets say the brilliance lit up the darkness like day. What were they describing? Bioluminescence? Electric lights? Some technology we don't have words for. The Sumerians used the term melem, often translated as divine radiance or terrifying splendor. But the descriptions are physical, tangible, something that could be seen, that produced actual light, that could be turned on or off. And then there are the flying objects. The tablets describe several of the Anunnaki as having the ability to travel through the air, not metaphorically ascending to heaven, but actually flying, using vehicles, using craft that moved between Earth and somewhere else. The sky, the heavens, the place the tablets consistently describe as another location, not a spiritual realm, but a physical place where the Anunnaki came from and could return to. Enki's boat is described as moving without oars, and being able to navigate both water and sky. Marduk possesses weapons that can destroy mountains. The goddess Ishtar has a boat of heaven that she uses to travel between cities. These aren't poetic metaphors. They're described with the same matter-of-fact tone the tablets use for everything else. Here are the things the gods possessed. Here is what those things could do. Imagine being a Sumerian scribe. You're copying an ancient text. You don't understand what you're copying, not fully. You're preserving words that have been passed down for generations, words describing objects and capabilities that don't exist in your world. So you use the language you have. You call them divine. You call them sacred. You assume they're meant metaphorically because you can't imagine them literally. But what if the original witnesses, the people who first told these stories, were describing real things they'd actually seen, advanced technology they didn't understand, rendered in the only terms they had available? Take the ziggurats. Every major Sumerian city had one. Step pyramids rising above the flat Mesopotamian plain, and the texts consistently describe them not primarily as temples, but as landing platforms, as bonds between heaven and earth, as places where the sky people could descend. The word ziggurat comes from the Akkadian zikkuratu, meaning to build on a raised area. They were enormous construction projects. The ziggurat at Ur, which partially survives today, had a base measuring 210 by 150 feet. It rose in 3 massive tiers to a height of over 100 feet. At the top was a small temple room, described as the place where the god would descend, where the connection between sky and earth was maintained. But why? If these were just temples, just places of worship, why build them so high? Why make them so massive? Why place them at the exact center of cities, with clear approaches from all directions? Why describe them in texts as places where the Anunnaki arrived and departed? The ruins suggest sophisticated engineering, mathematical precision, astronomical alignments. The corners of ziggurats point to cardinal directions with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible. with the tools the Sumerians supposedly possessed. The angles, the proportions, the internal structures all suggest knowledge of mathematics and engineering far beyond what we usually credit to Bronze Age civilizations, or knowledge that was taught, shared, given to human builders by beings who already knew these principles because they'd used them elsewhere. Take a breath. Let that settle. The Abzu, Enki's domain, is described in texts as an underground or underwater structure, a place of pure waters where Enki dwelt and conducted his work. Some scholars think it's mythological, the cosmic ocean, the primordial deep. But the descriptions are specific. It has rooms, facilities, places where the ME are stored, places where creation happens, where humans were fashioned, where knowledge is kept. Archaeological surveys of southern Iraq have found evidence of extensive ancient mining operations, deep shafts, tunnels, excavations that go far below the level needed for water or simple minerals, excavations that would have required significant effort, significant organization, significant reason to dig that deep. What were they mining? The tablets say gold. They say the Anunnaki needed it desperately, needed it continuously, needed it enough to create human workers specifically to bear the burden of extracting it. But why? Gold is valuable, beautiful, useful for jewelry and decoration. But why would advanced beings, capable of crossing space, need it so urgently? What were they using it for? Modern speculation ranges from the plausible to the fantastic. Atmospheric maintenance, radiation shielding, advanced electronics, energy systems, or perhaps something we can't even imagine because we don't have the framework to understand their needs. The tablets don't explain, they just record. The Anunnaki needed gold, they mined it, they worked for it, and when the Ajigi workers rebelled, when they refused to continue, humans were created to take their place, not to worship, not to pray, to work, to dig, to extract resources that beings from somewhere else needed to survive, or to prepare, or to leave. The technology described in these texts wasn't magic. It was specific, detailed, functional, objects that did things, vehicles that moved, lights that illuminated, devices that stored knowledge, structures that served as platforms and landing sites. And if even a fraction of these descriptions are based on actual observation, actual memory, then the Sumerians weren't inventing myths. They were documenting something that happened, recording it as accurately as they could, preserving it for a future that might, eventually, understand what they witnessed. The clay holds these accounts, patient, unchanging, still asking us to decide what we're reading. Stories, or reports, mythology, or memory. The question appears again and again in the tablets. The Anunnaki came to Earth for resources. They established operations. They organized labor. And the primary resource they sought, the one mentioned most consistently, was gold. The Atrahasis epic states it directly. The Anunnaki came to Earth and began to dig the gold. The Enuma Elish describes the organization of labor with 300 Anunnaki assigned to heaven and 600 assigned to Earth, and those on Earth were engaged in mining operations. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions the mines of the Abzu, where gold was extracted from deep within the earth. But here's what's strange. Mesopotamia doesn't have significant gold deposits. Never did. The Sumerians had to import gold from other regions, from Anatolia, from Egypt, from places far beyond their territory. So if the tablets describe the Anunnaki mining gold in the region, they must be describing either operations that occurred before the Sumerians arrived, or operations that happened elsewhere and were remembered in the stories. Some scholars have suggested that the Abzu, which Sumerian texts consistently place in the south, might refer to southern Africa. The word Abzu means deep waters or deep source, and in some contexts it's clearly mythological, the cosmic ocean. But in other contexts, it's described as a physical place, a location where Enki dwells, where mining happened, where the deepest excavations reached far into the earth. Southern Africa has some of the world's oldest and deepest gold mines. Archaeological evidence suggests mining there dates back thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands. Ancient shafts extend hundreds of feet down, excavated with techniques that required significant organization and effort. And some researchers have pointed out that genetic studies of human populations suggest southern Africa as a possible origin point for anatomically modern humans, which is interesting given that the tablets describe humans being created specifically to work the mines. It's speculative, controversial. Most mainstream archaeologists dismiss the connection, but the pattern is worth noting. The tablets describe mining operations in a place called the Abzu. Southern Africa has ancient deep mines, and both the tablets and modern genetics point to southern Africa as significant in early human history. Let's imagine, for a moment, what such an operation might have looked like, based on what the tablets describe, based on what we know about ancient mining techniques, based on the fragments we can piece together. Picture this. The year is 8000 BCE, give or take a millennium or three. The location is somewhere in what is now southern Africa, though the landscape looks different then, greener, wetter. Rivers flow that are now dry, forests grow where desert now dominates. The Ice Age has ended, the world is warming, but it's still cooler than it will become. There's a settlement here. Not human, not yet. The Anunnaki have established a base, structures that would look foreign to our eyes, technology we wouldn't recognize, and at the center, the mines, shafts descending into the earth, following veins of gold ore down deeper than seems reasonable for the reward. The Agigi are working, 300 of them assigned to this operation, digging, hauling ore to the surface, processing it through methods that leave little trace. The work is endless, exhausting, year after year, decade after decade. The tablets say 40 years pass this way. 40 years of continuous labor before the rebellion begins. What drove them to such desperation? What made gold so valuable to beings advanced enough to cross space? The tablets never explain, but they treat it as obvious, as self-evident. Of course they needed gold. Of course it was worth all this effort. Of course creating an entirely new species to work the mines made sense as a solution to the labor shortage. Modern speculation offers possibilities. Gold is an excellent conductor. It doesn't corrode. It's useful in advanced electronics. It can reflect radiation. In our space programs, we use gold foil on satellites and spacecraft for thermal regulation and radiation protection. If the Anunnaki were maintaining equipment, repairing ships, preparing for some long journey, gold would be valuable indeed. Or perhaps they needed it for atmospheric maintenance. Some researchers have suggested that gold particles suspended in a planet's atmosphere could help regulate temperature, could repair a damaged ozone layer, could protect against radiation from space. If the Anunnaki came from a world with environmental collapse, if they were refugees from planetary catastrophe, then gathering resources to either repair their home or sustain themselves elsewhere would be urgent, critical, worth any effort. The tablets describe the Anunnaki as desperate, as working urgently, as needing these resources so badly, they were willing to create human workers specifically for this purpose. That doesn't sound like colonization. It doesn't sound like casual exploitation. It sounds like survival. Take a breath here. There's no rush. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary. We know ancient people mined extensively. We know they had sophisticated techniques for metalworking and ore processing. We know trade networks for gold and other metals existed far earlier than we once thought. But connecting that evidence directly to the stories in Mesopotamian tablets requires leaps, inferences, willingness to consider possibilities that fall outside mainstream academic consensus. Still, the pattern persists. Tablets from different cities, different time periods, different scribes, all describing the same basic scenario. The Anunnaki came to Earth. They established mining operations. They worked for decades, possibly centuries. They created humans to help, and the resource they sought most urgently was gold. Whether that gold went to atmospheric maintenance, to technology repair, to preparing vehicles for departure, or to something we can't even guess, the tablets don't say. They just record it was needed, desperately. And the entire story of human creation, of civilization's beginning, of the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity, flows from that need. The mines are silent now. The ancient shafts, those that haven't collapsed, go down into darkness. The gold is long since extracted. The workers, first Igigi, then human, have been gone for millennia, but the earth remembers. Stone remembers. And somewhere in the depths, in tunnels that might be far older than official timelines acknowledge, evidence might still wait. Evidence of when the digging began, of who did it, of what they sought, and whether they found enough. The tablets suggest they didn't, that the work continued for thousands of years, that even after humans were created, after civilization was established, the resource gathering continued, right up until the flood, right up until the moment when the Anunnaki decided, or were forced, to leave. And perhaps that's the most unsettling implication. If they mined Earth for thousands of years and still didn't have what they needed, if all that effort wasn't enough, then whatever they were preparing for, whatever they were running from, required resources on a scale almost beyond comprehension, or perhaps they did succeed. Perhaps they gathered what they needed, and the flood wasn't punishment or population control, it was cleanup, erasure, removing evidence of their presence before they departed, leaving humanity to wonder, to remember dimly, to preserve in stories what had once been witnessed fact. The mystery remains, the question persists, and the gold, silent, inert, patient as the stone it was pulled from, continues to fascinate us thousands of years later, perhaps for the same reason it fascinated them. There's a term that appears in the tablets that modern readers often overlook, the Igigi. Lesser Anunnaki, workers, beings assigned to the most difficult tasks. They're mentioned throughout Mesopotamian literature, always distinct from the 7 who decree fate, or the 50 who advise. The Igigi were numerous, 300 of them, and they were the ones who actually did the work. They dug the canals, excavated the mines, built the infrastructure, while the great Anunnaki, Anu and Enlil and Enki and the others managed and directed. The Igigi laboured, and the tablets make it clear they weren't happy about it. The Atrahasis epic describes their rebellion in detail. 40 years they worked. The text is specific about the timeline, not a metaphorical period but an actual counted duration. 40 years of digging, hauling, processing ore, maintaining the operations that the Anunnaki had established on Earth. And finally, one night, they reached their limit. They gathered together, all 300 of them. They burned their tools, threw them into the fire as a symbol of refusal. Then they marched together to the dwelling of Enlil. They surrounded his house in the darkness, and Enlil woke to find his residence besieged by angry workers who had decided they were finished. The text says he was terrified. The supreme commander of Earth operations, the Lord of the Command, was afraid. He sent for Anu, the distant leader. He called an emergency council, and the great Anunnaki gathered to discuss what seemed, from their perspective, an unprecedented crisis. The workers had stopped working, and without them, the entire operation would collapse. It's a strange moment when you read it closely. These are beings described as gods in later religious interpretation, immortal, all-powerful, worthy of worship. But in this text, they're managers dealing with a labour dispute. They're not omnipotent. They're not beyond fear. They're not even particularly united in how to handle the situation. Enlil wanted to punish the rebels, to identify the ringleader and make an example of him. But Anu counselled caution. The Igigi were right. Their complaint was valid. The work was too hard. The conditions were unbearable. Simply punishing them wouldn't solve the underlying problem, and that's when Enki made his proposal. Don't punish the Igigi. Don't force them back to work. Instead, create substitutes. Make workers who can bear the physical burden without the consciousness to rebel. Fashion beings from the clay of earth, mix in divine essence to make them capable, but keep them simple enough to control. The council agreed. They had no better option. The mining had to continue, but the Igigi clearly couldn't be forced to resume. So humanity was created, not as the crown of creation, not as beings made in the divine image for fellowship with gods, but as replacements, substitutes, created specifically because the original workers had gone on strike. It's perhaps the least flattering creation story any culture has ever preserved, and yet the Sumerians kept it, copied it, passed it down through generations. Clearly, to them, it seemed like the truth, like what actually happened, like why humans exist at all. But there's another detail in the tablets, a detail about what happened to the Igigi after humans were created. They don't disappear entirely. They're mentioned in later texts, but with a different role. They're no longer miners, no longer labourers. Instead, they're described as watchers, as being stationed in the high places, as those who observe from above. The Book of Enoch, a Jewish text written much later, but clearly drawing from older Mesopotamian traditions, calls them the watchers, beings assigned to watch over humanity, to observe, to report, and famously, in Enoch's account, to eventually interfere, breeding with human women, teaching forbidden knowledge, creating the Nephilim. But that's a later development of the story. In the original Mesopotamian texts, the Igigi are simply reassigned, removed from the back-breaking labour of earth, and placed in what? The texts use terms like heaven, or the heights, or the upper realm. Not metaphorical spiritual realms, but physical locations above the earth. Were they in orbit? Were they stationed on structures or vehicles above the planet? Were they watching from mountains or towers? The tablets don't clarify. They just note, after the rebellion, after humanity was created, the Igigi were no longer doing the mining. They were watching, observing, stationed where they could see what was happening on the surface. And here's where it gets strange. Some tablets suggest the Igigi weren't entirely happy with this arrangement either. That being removed from Earth, being isolated in the heights, being reduced to observers while humans took over their work, was its own form of punishment. They had rebelled to escape labour, and in response, They were removed from the living world entirely. Imagine the psychology of that. You refuse to work, you demand better conditions, and instead of negotiating, instead of improving the situation, your employers create replacements, beings who will do your job without complaint, and you're reassigned to a position that's technically less physically demanding, but also more isolated, more removed, more like imprisonment than promotion. Perhaps that explains what some tablets hint at: a continuing resentment among the Igigi, a lingering anger, a sense that they'd been betrayed, replaced, rendered obsolete. And perhaps that's why later texts describe them interfering with humanity, coming down from their stations, interacting when they weren't supposed to, teaching things they weren't supposed to teach, breeding with humans to create hybrid offspring. Take a breath. Let that settle. The fate of the Igigi remains one of the stranger threads in Mesopotamian mythology. They appear prominently at the beginning, in the creation stories, in the accounts of early operations on Earth. Then they fade into the background, still mentioned, still present, but no longer central to the narrative. Where did they go? If they were stationed in the heights, and that was a physical location, then were they still there when the great Anunnaki departed? Did they leave too? Or were they left behind, stranded, watching over a humanity they resented, a humanity that had replaced them? The tablets don't give clear answers. Different texts contradict each other. Different cities preserve different versions. But the basic pattern remains consistent. The Igigi worked, rebelled, were replaced, and retreated into the background of the story, while humans took center stage. And if you read carefully, there's a sense in some texts that the Igigi never forgave humanity for existing, that we represented their obsolescence, that our creation was the direct cause of their diminishment, and that some of them, when opportunity arose, when supervision was lax, came down from their stations and engaged with humanity in ways that were forbidden, that caused problems, that led to the very conflicts and complications that ultimately resulted in the flood. We were created to solve a labor problem, but in solving it, we created other problems. Problems between the workers we replaced and the masters who created us. Problems that would echo through the rest of the story, right up to the moment when water covered the earth and everything reset. The Igigi watched still, according to some interpretations, from wherever they ended up, from whatever heights they were assigned to. Patient, resentful, wondering if their rebellion was worth it, wondering what might have been if they'd simply endured the labor a little longer, or wondering if the beings who created us were themselves running from something. What happens when that something arrives, and will the Watchers, when that moment comes, warn us, or will they simply observe as they were assigned to do, and let whatever happens happen? The stars turn slowly overhead, the same stars the Igigi would have seen from their stations, the same stars that have witnessed all of this, all of human history, with perfect patience and zero judgment, still watching, still silent, still keeping their counsel, just like the Igigi themselves. Hidden in the most famous story from ancient Mesopotamia, buried beneath centuries of religious reinterpretation, lies something darker than most people realize when they hear about the flood. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't divine judgment for human wickedness. It wasn't even primarily about humanity at all. According to the oldest versions of the story, the ones preserved in tablets from Nippur and Babylon and the flood was deliberate, planned, executed by Enlil with the full knowledge and cooperation of most of the Anunnaki Council, and the reason had nothing to do with morality or sin. The reason was noise. The Atrahasis epic states it plainly. The land had grown numerous, the people multiplied. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and said to the great gods, "The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I cannot sleep." Not wickedness, not violence, not corruption. Noise. Humanity had become too numerous, too active, too loud, and Enlil, who valued order and quiet and control, decided to solve the problem permanently. First he tried disease. The tablets describe how he sent plague among humans to reduce their numbers. But Enki intervened, teaching humans medicine, showing them which herbs healed, and which prayers worked, and how to care for the sick. Humanity survived. Then Enlil tried drought. He withheld rain, dried up the rivers, made the land barren. But again Enki interfered, teaching humans about irrigation, about digging wells, about storing water against lean times. Humanity adapted. Then Enlil tried famine. He poisoned the soil, made crops fail, created conditions where nothing would grow. And again, Enki found ways around it, teaching humans about different crops, about moving to new lands, about techniques to restore fertility. Humanity persisted. Each time, Enki undermined the attempt at population control. Each time, humanity not only survived but learnt something new, became more resilient, more knowledgeable, more difficult to eliminate through indirect means. So finally, Enlil proposed a solution that would require no human cooperation to survive, a solution that would be total, complete, beyond interference. He would use the waters of the deep. He would cause the fountains of the Abzu to burst open, the rains to fall without ceasing, the rivers to overflow their banks. He would drown the earth. And this time, he made the other Anunnaki swear an oath of secrecy. None of them would warn humanity, none would interfere. They would simply retreat to the sky, to their vessels or stations above the earth, and wait for the waters to do their work. The oath was binding. Even Enki, who had protected humanity through every previous attempt, couldn't directly break it. But Enki was clever. He didn't warn a human, not directly. Instead, the tablets say, he spoke to a reed wall. He happened to be near the reed house where Atrahasis slept, and he happened to speak out loud, to the wall, describing in detail what was coming, and exactly how one might survive it. Reed wall, wall, listen to me. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions and save life. The boat you will build, its dimensions shall be equal, its length and breadth shall correspond. Roof it over like the Apsu, so that the sun will not see inside it. Specific instructions, exact dimensions, technical details about waterproofing with bitumen and pitch, lists of what to bring, who to save, how to provision for the aftermath, all spoken to a wall where Atrahasis just happened to overhear. It's almost humorous, the legal loophole. Enki didn't warn a human, he just spoke near one, didn't break the oath technically, but saved humanity practically. Take a breath here, there's no rush. When the flood came, when the weapons were released and the waters rose, the tablets describe the Anunnaki retreating to orbit or to the heights. And there, watching the devastation below, something unexpected happened. The text says they began to weep. They were horrified by what they'd done, by the scale of destruction, by the totality of the erasure. The Anunnaki wept with her. The gods sat weeping. Their lips were parched with thirst. They hadn't expected it to be so terrible, hadn't anticipated the guilt, the regret, the horror of watching an entire world drown. And when the waters finally receded, when Atrahasis emerged from his boat and made an offering to the gods, when the smoke rose into the sky, and the Anunnaki descended and smelled the sweet savour, the text says they gathered around like flies, desperate for the offering, because they'd had nothing to eat. No one had been making offerings, no one had been tending the temples, or performing the rituals, or providing the sustenance the Anunnaki apparently needed from human worship or service. They realized their mistake. Without humans, they had no support system, no workers, no worship, no infrastructure. They needed humanity, even as they tried to destroy it. Enlil was furious when he learned that Atrahasis had survived, that someone had warned him that humanity would continue. But Anu, the distant leader, counseled acceptance. The decision was made. Humanity would be allowed to persist, but with new conditions, new limitations, shorter lifespans, more difficult childbirth, restrictions on the hybrid bloodlines that had been mixing divine and human. The flood marked a reset, a division between the age before, when the Anunnaki walked openly among humans, when hybrid kings ruled for thousands of years, when the connection between heaven and earth was direct and visible, and the age after, when the gods became more distant, when human lifespans normalized, when the direct interference stopped, or mostly stopped, because the tablets suggest some Anunnaki, particularly some of the Igigi, continued to interact with humanity, continued to interfere, continued to teach and breed and create complications that would eventually require another intervention, another judgment, another attempt to separate divine from human. But here's what's unsettling when you read these texts carefully. The flood wasn't punishment for human behavior. Humans hadn't done anything wrong. They'd simply existed, multiplied, made noise. They'd fulfilled exactly the purpose they were created for, working, building civilization, spreading across the land, and for that, for succeeding at being human, they were nearly annihilated. It suggests the Anunnaki never really saw humanity as having inherent value. We were tools, created for a purpose, and when we became inconvenient, when we fulfilled our purpose too well, and became numerous and noisy and difficult to control, the solution was elimination. Only Enki, consistently, throughout all these stories, Enki alone seemed to believe humans deserved to continue, that we had value beyond our utility, that we should be taught, protected, allowed to develop, and he broke rules to ensure it. defied authority, risked his own standing to save a species he'd helped create. The floodwaters are long gone. Mesopotamia is dry now, mostly desert. The rivers still flow, but they're smaller, less wild. The cities that drowned are buried under millennia of sediment, but the memory persists, pressed into clay, copied and recopied through centuries, preserved because someone, some scribe, some culture, thought this story was important enough to remember. Not as religious allegory, not as moral instruction, but as history, as what actually happened, as the moment when humanity almost ended, and was saved by a technicality, and one god's unwillingness to follow orders. The tablets suggest Enlil never fully forgave either humanity for surviving, or Enki for enabling that survival. The tension between them continued. The disagreement about humanity's place and purpose remained unresolved, and perhaps that's why the Anunnaki eventually departed, not because their work was done, but because the conflict over what to do about humanity had no solution that satisfied everyone. They left, and humanity remained, still making noise, still multiplying, still spreading across the earth, doing exactly what we were created to do, still here, despite everything. Because one Anunnaki decided we deserved the chance to continue. Beneath all the stories of creation and labor and floods, hidden in the fragments and the gaps between tablets, there's a darker question. One that the texts hint at, but never quite answer directly. If the Anunnaki were so advanced, if they could cross space and create life and organize civilizations, then why did they come to Earth at all? What were they doing here? And more importantly, what were they preparing for? The tablets contain clues, references scattered across different texts, different time periods, different cities, references to destruction, to catastrophe, to a home that could no longer sustain them, to something left behind that couldn't be returned to. The Enuma Elish describes the cosmic war between Tiamat and Marduk. But what if that's not just mythology? What if it's a memory encoded in religious language of an actual catastrophe, a collision between planetary bodies, a destruction that left the solar system, or some part of it, fundamentally altered? The text describes Tiamat being split apart, her body divided, half becoming sky, half becoming earth, her ribs forming the vault of heaven, her eyes becoming rivers, its creation from destruction, order from chaos, but also the suggestion that something once whole was torn apart, that the current arrangement of things came from violence, from catastrophe, from something being destroyed. Modern astronomy knows that our solar system has a history of violence. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter is likely the remains of a planet that never fully formed, or one that was destroyed early in solar system history. The Moon is thought to have formed from debris when Earth was struck by a massive object. Planets migrate, orbits shift, collisions happen. What if the Anunnaki came from that destroyed planet, or from a moon of Jupiter that lost its atmosphere, or from Mars, which shows evidence of once having liquid water, a magnetic field, possibly conditions suitable for life? What if they were survivors of a planetary catastrophe, refugees looking for somewhere, anywhere, that could sustain them while they gathered resources to either rebuild or move on? The tablets mention Nibiru, the planet of crossing, a world with an unusual orbit that brought it periodically into the inner solar system, described as the home of the Anunnaki, but also described in terms that suggest it wasn't stable, that its orbit was problematic, that it was cold, distant, difficult to sustain life on for extended periods. Perhaps Nibiru wasn't their original home, perhaps it was already a refuge, a remnant, a piece of whatever world they'd originally inhabited, and coming to Earth wasn't colonization, it was a desperate search for resources they could no longer produce or maintain on their own. That would explain the urgency, the mining, the infrastructure, the creation of workers. They weren't building an empire, they were surviving, gathering what they needed, racing against what? Time, the degradation of their technology, the failure of whatever systems kept them alive, or something else. Some tablets contain references that are more disturbing, references to the destroyer, to the weapon of the skies, to something that crosses the heavens and brings terror, to entities or forces that even the Anunnaki feared, not other gods, not rival powers in the usual sense, but something external, something dangerous, something they were hiding from. What if they weren't just refugees from environmental collapse? What if they were fleeing something actively dangerous, something that had destroyed their original world, or forced them to leave, or pursued them through space, and Earth, remote, primitive, inhabited only by hunter-gatherers who couldn't possibly threaten advanced technology, was a perfect hiding place? That would explain why the flood might not have been just population control. It might have been erasure, removing evidence, destroying traces of their presence, making Earth look uninhabited, pristine, not worth investigating, and then departing before whatever they feared arrived. Take a breath. Let that settle. This is speculation. The tablets don't state any of this clearly, but the pieces are there, the references to destruction, to fleeing, to desperate resource gathering, to creating workers, because they themselves were too few, or too exhausted, or too desperate to do the work, to conflicts among themselves about how to proceed, to eventually leaving, departing Earth, returning to wherever they came from, or continuing to wherever they were going. And if they were running, if they were hiding, then the question becomes, did it find them? Is it still looking? And if Earth was once a refuge for fleeing survivors of some cosmic catastrophe, could it become one again? The tablets from different eras show a progression. Early texts describe the Anunnaki as present, active, involved in human affairs. Middle period texts describe them as more distant, more removed, appearing only occasionally. Late texts, from the last centuries of Mesopotamian civilization, describe them as having departed entirely, as being remembered, as being invoked in prayer, but no longer present in any direct sense. They left. Sometime around 2000 BCE, give or take a few centuries, the direct presence stopped. Kings no longer claimed to be descended from gods who walked the earth. Ziggurats were still maintained, but no longer as landing platforms, now purely as temples. The stories remained but shifted from history to mythology, from reports to religion. What changed? Did they complete their mission? Did they gather enough resources to move on, to repair whatever needed repairing, to go home, or to go elsewhere? Or did something else happen? Something that required them to leave quickly? Something that made Earth no longer safe as a hiding place? The tablets don't say, they just record. The gods were here. They did these things. They taught these arts. They created humanity. They governed for thousands of years. Then they left. And humanity continued without them, with only the memory and the stories and the ruins to suggest they'd ever been here at all. Perhaps that was always the plan. Come, gather resources, create workers to continue the gathering, then depart once you have what you need. Use Earth as a temporary base, a way station, a resource depot, and move on when you're ready. Or perhaps they never planned to leave. Perhaps they were forced to. Perhaps whatever they were running from caught up with them, or came close enough that hiding was no longer possible. Or perhaps they simply realized that staying was more dangerous than continuing to run. The stars hold no answers. They shine the same way they shone when the Anunnaki were here. The same constellations wheel overhead. The same planets orbit. The same moon rises and sets. If there are signs in the heavens of cosmic catastrophe, of destroyed worlds, of refugees fleeing through space, we haven't learnt to read them yet. But the tablets suggest the Anunnaki could read them, that they watched the skies constantly, that they tracked orbits and calculated returns and predicted celestial events with precision that still impresses modern astronomers. They were watching for something, waiting for something, preparing for something, and when the moment came, whatever that moment was, they left, leaving us behind, with questions, with stories, with ruins that suggest capabilities we can barely imagine, with genetic mysteries about how modern humans emerged so suddenly, with such specific traits, from ancestors who'd lived unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years. We're still here, still making noise, still spreading across the world, and now beyond it, still looking at the stars and wondering what's out there, still digging in the earth for resources we need, still building structures that reach toward the sky, still doing, perhaps, exactly what we were created to do, and perhaps, somewhere, watching, hoping we're ready, or fearing we're not. The mystery remains, patient as the stars, silent as the void, waiting. There's a word that appears in Babylonian astronomical texts that has caused more controversy than almost any other term in ancient studies: Nibiru, the planet of crossing, or planet of the ferry, a celestial body described in star catalogues and astronomical observations, listed among the planets, assigned to the god Marduk, but never quite matching any planet we recognize today. The Enuma Elish describes how Marduk, after defeating Tiamat, was elevated to supreme position among the gods, and as part of his elevation, he was assigned a celestial body, a planet, one that crossed the paths of other planets, one whose orbit brought it periodically through the inner solar system, then took it back out to distant reaches where it couldn't be seen. Babylonian astronomers were sophisticated. They tracked planetary movements with remarkable precision. They could predict eclipses. They understood orbital periods. They recognized the difference between planets and stars, knew that planets wandered while stars remained fixed in their patterns, and they knew about Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, the ones that dominated their astronomical observations. But they also wrote about Nibiru, as though it were another planet, as though it belonged in the catalogue, as though it crossed the heavens on a schedule they understood and tracked. Modern scholars are divided. Many believe Nibiru was simply Jupiter, that the Babylonians used different names for the same planet in different contexts. That planet of crossing was a poetic description, not a reference to a separate body, that the astronomical texts are describing known planets using elaborate mythological language. Others aren't so sure. The descriptions don't quite fit. The orbital characteristics mentioned in some texts don't match Jupiter. The associations, the mythological connections, the emphasis on Nibiru as Marduk's special domain suggests something distinct, something that crossed through the solar system on a long orbit, something that appeared, dominated the sky during its passage, then disappeared for long periods. Could there be an undiscovered planet in our solar system, one with a highly elliptical orbit that takes it far beyond the known planets, then brings it back through on a long cycle? Modern astronomy has discovered trans-Neptunian objects, dwarf planets like Pluto and Eris, objects in the Kuiper belt and beyond, and some astronomers have proposed, based on orbital irregularities they observe, that there might be a planet 9 out there, a world several times Earth's mass, orbiting so far out that we haven't detected it yet, but whose gravitational influence affects other objects in the outer solar system. The evidence is indirect, observational, based on mathematical modelling and orbital dynamics, but the possibility is taken seriously by mainstream astronomers, not because of ancient texts, but because the mathematics suggests something's out there, something large enough to affect orbits, something we haven't seen yet. If such a planet exists, if its orbit is highly elliptical, bringing it close enough to be visible from Earth every few thousand years, then ancient astronomers might have observed it, might have tracked it, might have recorded its appearances and incorporated them into their astronomical models. And if the Anunnaki came from such a world, if Nibiru was their home, then the timeline in the tablet starts to make sense. They arrive when Nibiru comes through the inner solar system. They establish operations, they create infrastructure and workers, they gather resources. Then, when Nibiru's orbit takes it back out, they have a choice. Go with it, back to the cold and dark, or stay on Earth, warm, hospitable, but without easy access to their home world. Perhaps some stayed, perhaps some left. Perhaps that's why the tablets describe conflicts among the Anunnaki, different factions with different priorities, some wanting to maintain Earth as a permanent base, others seeing it as temporary, some growing attached to their human creations, others seeing them as expendable workers. Take a breath here. There's no rush. The tablets describe Nibiru's orbit, not in modern astronomical terms, but in ways that can be translated to orbital mechanics if you're willing to make certain assumptions. They describe it as taking 3,600 years to complete one circuit, as coming from the direction we now call the Kuiper belt, as passing through the inner solar system, close enough to affect other planets, close enough to be seen clearly from Earth, then continuing back out into the darkness. If that's accurate, if Nibiru exists and has that orbital period, then it would have been in the inner solar system around 10,000 BCE, and again around 6,400 BCE, and again around 2,800 BCE, and again, by this calculation, it would be due around 800 CE, but we have no historical records of a massive planet appearing in the sky in 800 CE, no global observations of a celestial body that dominated the heavens. So either the orbital period is wrong, or Nibiru doesn't exist, or it's not as large or visible as the tablet suggests, or something else is happening that we don't understand. The mystery deepens when you consider what the tablets say about Nibiru's condition. It's not described as a paradise, it's described as cold, dark, difficult, a place where the Anunnaki struggled to survive, where resources were scarce, where environmental conditions were harsh, and that's supposedly why they came to Earth. Because Nibiru, whatever it was, whatever it is, couldn't sustain them anymore. Was it always that way, or did something happen to it? Did it lose its atmosphere, suffer a catastrophic impact, drift into an orbit that took it too far from the sun to maintain warmth? The Enuma Elish describes cosmic violence, planetary collisions, worlds torn apart. Perhaps Nibiru is a survivor of that violence, a remnant, a piece of something larger that was destroyed, and the Anunnaki themselves are the descendants of whatever civilization existed before the catastrophe. If so, they're refugees, not just from Nibiru, but from something that destroyed the world Nibiru came from, running not from one disaster, but from a chain of disasters, looking for stability that kept eluding them, and Earth stable, warm, abundant with life and resources, must have seemed like salvation, for a while. The tablets suggest it didn't last, that eventually, for whatever reason, the Anunnaki left Earth too, returned to Nibiru during one of its passages through the inner solar system, or went elsewhere, or simply withdrew from direct interaction with humanity while remaining somewhere in the solar system, watching from a distance. Some modern researchers, the ones who take these texts as potentially historical, believe Nibiru might return, that its orbit continues, that every 3,600 years or so it comes back through, and when it does, perhaps the Anunnaki return with it, check on their creation, observe what we've become, decide whether to intervene or remain hidden. It's speculation built on speculation. Most astronomers dismiss the idea of Nibiru entirely. Most historians read the tablets as pure mythology. Most archaeologists see no evidence that advanced beings ever visited Earth or created humanity, or did any of the things the Sumerian texts describe. But the tablets remain. The astronomical observations remain. The precision of ancient sky-watching, the sophistication of their mathematics, the things they knew about planetary movements and celestial cycles, all suggest they were observing something, recording something, tracking something with purpose and consistency. Whether that something was Nibiru, whether Nibiru was the Anunnaki's home, whether any of this connects to the creation stories and the flood narratives and the sudden emergence of civilization, we may never know with certainty. But the question persists, patient as the orbits themselves, silent as the spaces between planets, waiting, like everything in this story, for the moment when distance closes and return becomes possible. The stars wheel overhead, the planets follow their paths, and somewhere, perhaps, something crosses through the darkness on an orbit we've forgotten how to track. Still coming, still going, still holding secrets that clay tablets tried to preserve, still asking us to look up, to calculate, to wonder, to remember that we once knew more than we think we did, and to consider that maybe, just maybe, someone might be coming back to check their work. The question that haunts every reading of these tablets, every attempt to understand the Anunnaki story, is the one that's never directly answered. What were they running from? The texts give fragments, hints, references that suggest catastrophe, but never explain it fully. The Enuma Elish speaks of Tiamat, a planetary body torn apart, of cosmic war, of violence in the heavens that reshaped the solar system itself. But was this mythology, memory, or both? Ancient people trying to preserve knowledge of actual events, using the only framework they had, dressing astronomical catastrophe in the language of gods and monsters. Some scholars believe the Anunnaki story is pure mythology from start to finish, that the Sumerians were trying to explain their world, their origins, their place in the cosmos, and they created elaborate narratives involving beings from the sky, because that's what ancient people did. Every culture has creation myths. Every civilization tells stories about how things began. The Mesopotamian versions are simply more detailed, more specific, more technological in their descriptions, but fundamentally no different from Greek myths or Norse legends, or any other ancient attempt to understand existence. Others suggest there's a kernel of historical truth buried in the mythology, that the Sumerians were preserving genuine memories of contact with an advanced civilization, not necessarily beings from another planet, but perhaps survivors of an earlier, more sophisticated human civilization that was destroyed in some catastrophe. Perhaps the Anunnaki were priests or scientists or leaders from that lost culture who survived and taught the emerging Sumerian civilization. Perhaps the stories of flying vehicles and advanced technology were exaggerated memories, growing more elaborate with each retelling, but based on real capabilities that existed before the catastrophe. The flood certainly happened. Geological evidence confirms massive flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BCE, river sediment layers, evidence of sudden inundation, cities buried underwater and rebuilt on top of the ruins. So the core of the flood story is historical fact. Whether it was as global and catastrophic as the tablets describe, whether it was deliberately caused, whether anyone was warned in advance, those are the questions that remain open. But what about the earlier catastrophe, the one that supposedly destroyed the Anunnaki's original home? Is there any evidence in our solar system of planetary destruction, of worlds torn apart, of the kind of cosmic violence the Enuma Elish describes? Actually, yes, there is. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter is likely the remains of a planet that never fully formed, or one that was destroyed early in solar system history. The Moon formed from debris when Earth was struck by a massive object early in its existence. Mars shows evidence of having once possessed a magnetic field and liquid water, both of which it lost catastrophically at some point. The outer planets have moons that show signs of past collisions and orbital disruptions. Our solar system has a violent history, Planets migrate, orbits shift, collisions happen. In the early days of solar system formation, massive impacts were common. Worlds formed and were destroyed. Bodies collided and merged or shattered. The stable system we observe today emerged from billions of years of chaos. If an advanced civilization existed in our solar system during that chaotic period, if they developed on a world that was then destroyed or rendered uninhabitable, they would have become refugees, survivors looking for somewhere else to go, and Earth, once it stabilized, once its orbit settled, and its conditions became hospitable, would have been an obvious choice. Take a breath. Let that settle. A few researchers, mostly outside mainstream academia, have suggested that Mars might have been that original home, that the Anunnaki were Martians, survivors of whatever catastrophe stripped Mars of its atmosphere and turned it from a potentially habitable world into a frozen desert, that they came to Earth when their home became uninhabitable, bringing their technology and knowledge, establishing bases and operations, creating human workers from Earth's existing hominid populations through genetic manipulation. It's highly speculative. Most scientists dismiss it, but Mars does show intriguing features. Formations that some interpret as ancient riverbeds, evidence of past water, the possibility that life once existed there, and that massive scar across its surface. Valles Marineris, a canyon system so vast it dwarfs anything on Earth. Some have wondered if that's evidence of catastrophic impact, of something that tore into Mars and began the process of its environmental collapse. Perhaps that's what the tablets mean by the destroyed planet. Not a world that was completely obliterated, but one that was rendered uninhabitable, that lost its atmosphere, its water, its ability to sustain the civilization that had developed there, and the survivors, the Anunnaki, had to evacuate, had to find refuge elsewhere, had to come to the only other habitable world in the solar system, Earth. Others imagine the catastrophe was different. Not planetary destruction, but something else. War, perhaps. Not metaphorical cosmic war, but actual conflict between civilizations, between factions, using weapons we can barely imagine, weapons that could destroy mountains as the tablets describe, that could affect entire worlds, that could render planets uninhabitable, not through accident but through deliberate use of devastating technology. If so, then the Anunnaki weren't just refugees from environmental catastrophe. They were survivors of war, possibly refugees from the losing side, possibly fleeing from whoever won that conflict, possibly hiding on Earth because it was remote enough, primitive enough, that whoever they were fleeing from might not look here. That would explain the secrecy, the withdrawal, the eventual departure. They weren't here to colonize or conquer. They were here to hide, to gather resources quietly, to prepare for eventual escape or defense. And when they left, it might have been because hiding was no longer sufficient, because they'd been found, or because they'd gathered what they needed to move on, or because staying put humanity at risk from whatever they were fleeing. We may never know. The tablets don't tell us. They preserve fragments, pieces, hints of a larger story that's been lost to time, and perhaps that's intentional. Perhaps the full story was deliberately obscured. Perhaps the Anunnaki didn't want humanity to know exactly what they were running from, didn't want us to fear it, or to become involved in conflicts that weren't our concern. Or perhaps the story was simply forgotten, lost in the transitions from oral tradition to written record, distorted by time and retelling, reduced from clear history to vague mythology, buried under centuries of religious reinterpretation that turned refugees into gods and survival into divine mandate. The silence of the solar system offers no answers. Mars is dead. The asteroid belt holds no readable records. The outer planets and their moons spin in darkness, keeping whatever secrets they might possess. And Earth, warm, living, vibrant Earth, continues as it has for billions of years, indifferent to the questions we ask about who might have visited, what they were fleeing, whether they'll return. Maybe the catastrophe was environmental. Maybe it was war. Maybe it was something we don't have concepts for. Some disaster specific to spacefaring civilizations. Some risk that emerges when you achieve certain capabilities. Maybe they were running from something external, or maybe from themselves, from their own mistakes, from consequences of their own actions. The tablets suggest desperation, urgency, need. The Anunnaki weren't leisurely exploring. They were working frantically, mining desperately, building urgently, creating workers quickly because they didn't have time to do it themselves. That's not the behavior of colonizers or conquerors. That's the behavior of refugees running out of time. Running out of time before what? Before Nibiru's orbit took them back out to the cold? Before their technology failed completely? Before their population dwindled below sustainable levels? Before whatever they were fleeing caught up with them? Or perhaps before we became too numerous, too knowledgeable, too much like them, and they could no longer maintain the fiction that we were just workers, just servants, just created beings with no rights or autonomy. Perhaps they left because we started asking questions, started wanting answers, started becoming inconveniently human. The mystery remains, patient, silent, buried in clay and stone, and the gaps between what the tablets say and what they leave unsaid. And perhaps that's where it should stay. Perhaps some questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is part of the story, part of what makes it continue to fascinate, part of what keeps us digging, translating, wondering. The catastrophe they fled, whatever it was, reshaped their entire existence, turned them from whatever they'd been into refugees, into survivors, into beings who had to start over on an alien world with limited resources and no guarantee of success, just like humanity has had to do, multiple times, after ice ages, after floods, after collapses and catastrophes, and near extinctions. Perhaps that's the real connection. Not that they created us, but that we're alike, both survivors, both refugees from lost worlds, lost ages, lost golden times that ended in disaster, both still here, still adapting, still surviving, still wondering what we're running from, and whether it might catch up. There's a thread in the tablets that's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. A suggestion, subtle, disturbing, that the Anunnaki themselves might have been afraid, not just of environmental collapse or resource depletion or the challenges of survival, but of something else, something they never named directly, something they might have been hiding from. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a strange passage. When Gilgamesh travels to meet Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, he passes through a tunnel guarded by scorpion men. These beings tell him that no one, not even the gods, has ever passed through this tunnel except when the sun itself travels through it at night. Even the gods avoid this path. Even the Anunnaki won't go there. Why? What's in the darkness that even advanced beings fear? Some interpret it mythologically. The underworld, the realm of death, the places gods don't go because they're immortal, and death is foreign to them. Standard mythological territory. Nothing unusual, but others wonder if the tablets are describing something else. Real places, real dangers, real reasons why certain paths were avoided, certain regions were forbidden, certain knowledge was restricted. The tablets mention the Watchers of the Watchers, a phrase that appears in a few texts without clear explanation. Who watches the Watchers? If the Igigi were stationed to observe humanity, to monitor Earth, then who monitored them? Who checked on the Anunnaki to ensure they were following what? Rules, protocols, agreements made with some higher authority. The Book of Enoch, written much later, but drawing from older Mesopotamian traditions, expands on this idea. It describes watchers who descend to Earth and interfere with humanity, teaching forbidden knowledge, breeding with human women, creating the Nephilim, and it describes punishment for these actions. Other entities, higher authorities, descending to bind the transgressing watchers in darkness until some appointed time of judgment. If the watchers are the Igigi, if Enoch's account preserves genuine memory of what happened, then the implications are unsettling. The Anunnaki weren't the top of the hierarchy. They were themselves subject to oversight, to rules, to consequences, if they violated protocols about interaction with developing civilizations. Maybe that's why they eventually withdrew. Not because they wanted to, not because their work was complete, but because they'd broken rules, interfered too much, created hybrids they weren't supposed to create, shared knowledge they were supposed to withhold. And when the enforcers came, when the Watchers of the Watchers arrived to assess the situation, the Anunnaki had to leave, had to accept restrictions, had to abandon their projects and their human creations. Or perhaps the threat was more direct. Perhaps whatever destroyed their original home, whatever made them refugees, was still out there, still moving through space, still dangerous. And they came to Earth not just for resources, but to hide, to become invisible, to operate quietly in a backwater solar system where no one would think to look for them. And the flood, the deliberate flood, might have been their attempt to erase evidence, to eliminate signs of advanced civilization, to make Earth look primitive again, uninhabited, not worth investigating, so that when whatever they feared came looking, it would find nothing, would move on, would leave Earth alone. But then humans survived, started rebuilding, started advancing, and within a few thousand years, we were creating civilizations again, writing, building, making ourselves visible, making Earth notable. And perhaps that's when the Anunnaki realized they had to leave, not because of us, but because keeping us alive meant keeping Earth visible, and visibility meant danger. Take a breath here. There's no rush. This is speculation layered on speculation. The tablets don't state any of this clearly, but the fragments are there, the references to destruction, to flight, to hiding, to urgency, to conflicts among the Anunnaki themselves about what to do, how long to stay, when to leave, to the flood as potential erasure rather than just punishment, to their eventual departure around 2000 BCE, when direct interaction ceased and they became memories rather than presences. Some researchers have noticed patterns in ancient texts from around the world, stories of sky people or star beings who came, taught, then left. Stories that share remarkable similarities despite geographical separation. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of sky beings who shaped the land and taught ceremonies. Native American traditions describe star people who brought knowledge. African traditions mention ancestors who came from the sky. Asian traditions preserve accounts of divine emperors who descended from heaven. Are these all independent mythologies? Parallel evolution of similar stories because humans everywhere wonder about their origins? Or are they all preserving fragments of the same event, the same visitation, the same period when something not from Earth was here and interacted with developing human populations? If the latter, if there was genuine contact, then what these traditions share is instructive. The visitors came, they taught, they helped humanity develop, then they left, returned to the sky, departed to wherever they came from, and they made it clear, in these traditions, that they were leaving because it was time, because humanity was ready to continue alone, because their presence was no longer necessary or appropriate, or, perhaps, because staying was no longer safe. The cosmos is vast, ancient beyond comprehension, and it's not empty. We know now that stars have planets, that planets are common, that the conditions for life exist in millions, billions of locations throughout the galaxy. And if life is common, then intelligence might be too. And if intelligence is common, then advanced civilizations might exist at many different stages of development, some young, some ancient, some helpful, some dangerous. Perhaps the Anunnaki came from one such civilization. Perhaps they were fleeing another. Perhaps Earth was a refuge in a much larger, much more complex, much more populated galaxy than we've imagined. And perhaps our isolation, our apparent loneliness in the cosmos, is protective, keeps us hidden, keeps us safe from conflicts and catastrophes that play out on scales we can't yet comprehend. Or perhaps we're reading too much into ancient texts. Perhaps the Anunnaki are pure mythology. Perhaps the similarities in traditions worldwide reflect common human psychology, not common experience. Perhaps we're alone after all, and these stories are just stories, beautiful, meaningful, but not historical. We may never know for certain. The evidence is too fragmentary. The time is too distant. The cultural filters between their experience and our interpretation are too thick, and perhaps that's acceptable. Perhaps the not knowing is part of being human, part of living with mystery, part of accepting that some questions have answers we can't access. But the tablets remain, the traditions remain, the ruins remain, the mysteries remain, and somewhere in the space between what we can prove and what we can imagine, the possibility remains that we're not the first intelligence to walk this planet, that we're not alone in the cosmos, that visitors once came, for reasons we don't fully understand, from places we can't quite identify, fleeing threats we can't quite name, and that they left behind not just stories but questions, questions that echo through millennia, questions that we're still trying to answer, questions that might, eventually, help us understand not just where we came from, but where we're going, and whether, when we finally venture beyond Earth ourselves, we'll be explorers or refugees, helpers or threats, remembered fondly or fled from. The stars keep their secrets, the clay holds its fragments, and the mystery, patient as always, waits for time to reveal whatever truth it's protecting, or for us to become wise enough, advanced enough, mature enough to handle the answers we seek. Either way, the questions remain beautiful, compelling, worth asking, even if answers never come, because wondering, perhaps, is part of what makes us human. And if the Anunnaki gave us anything beyond life, beyond civilization, beyond knowledge, maybe they gave us that, the ability to wonder, the need to ask, the hunger to know, even if knowing is impossible, even if mystery is all we'll ever have. Perhaps that's enough. The direct presence ended gradually, not all at once, not with a single departure but with a slow withdrawal, like tide receding from a shore, leaving behind evidence of what had been, but taking the living connection with it. Around 2000 BCE, something changed in Mesopotamia. The texts shift in tone. Kings who had previously claimed to be sons of gods, to have divine blood flowing through their veins, began using different language. They were still appointed by the gods, still ruled with divine mandate. But the direct lineage, the claim of hybrid ancestry, that faded, became metaphorical, became honorific rather than literal. The ziggurats were still maintained, still central to every major city, but the descriptions of their function changed. No longer landing platforms or bonds between heaven and earth in the old physical sense, now purely temples, places of worship, places where priests conducted rituals and made offerings, the expectation of actual divine descent, that quiet certainty that gods would literally appear at the summit, that disappeared from the texts. The stories remained, were still copied, still preserved, still considered sacred, but they moved from the realm of living memory into the realm of ancient history, from things that happened recently, within memory, to things that happened long ago, in the time of ancestors, in the age before the present age. The Anunnaki departed, or withdrew, or simply stopped interacting directly with humanity in ways that left documentary evidence, and civilization continued without them, absorbing what they'd taught, preserving what they'd shared, but moving forward independently. It's remarkable how much survived. The mathematical systems the Sumerians used, base 60, the foundation of how we measure time and angles even today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. We inherited that from Mesopotamia, from systems that trace back to the earliest Sumerian tablets, from knowledge that came from somewhere and never entirely left. The astronomical observations survived too. The Babylonians became master astronomers, tracking planetary movements with precision that wouldn't be matched again for thousands of years. They knew orbital periods, could predict eclipses, understood planetary retrograde motion. They preserved records, generation after generation of observations, building on what had come before, and they still watched for Nibiru, still tracked the planet of crossing, still recorded its expected returns, still maintained the knowledge that somewhere out there, in an orbit that took it far beyond the known planets, something moved through the darkness on a schedule that mattered. Take a breath. Let that settle. When Mesopotamian civilization finally collapsed, when the last cuneiform tablets were written, when the cities were abandoned and the language forgotten, the knowledge didn't entirely die, it transferred to Persia, to Greece, to Rome, to the Islamic scholars who preserved and translated ancient texts, to medieval Europeans who rediscovered classical learning, each culture preserving pieces, fragments, elements of what had once been a complete system of knowledge. The Hebrew Bible preserved the flood story, adapted it, made Atrahasis into Noah, made the Anunnaki Council into a single god, made the story fit a monotheistic framework, but the core remained: the warning, the boat, the dimensions, the survival, the promise that such destruction wouldn't come again. Memory transformed, but not lost. Greek philosophers studied in Egypt and Babylon, bringing back mathematical and astronomical knowledge that formed the foundation of Western science. Pythagoras, Plato, all the early Greek thinkers drew from older sources, from traditions that traced back to Mesopotamia, to knowledge that had been old when Athens was young. And through all those centuries, through all those cultural transitions, the clay tablets remained, buried under sand, under ruins, under the ruins, preserved by the very dryness of the climate that had eventually reclaimed the cities, protected by obscurity, until archaeology began. The 1800s brought the first systematic excavations, European scholars digging in Iraq, in what had been Mesopotamia, uncovering buried cities, finding tablets by the thousands, stacked in temple archives, scattered in ruins, preserved despite everything, still readable, still sharp with the impressions made 4,000 years earlier. George Smith, discovering the flood story, Henry Layard uncovering Nineveh, Leonard Woolley excavating Gur, each adding pieces to the puzzle, each revealing more about what the Sumerians knew, how they lived, what they believed. And slowly, painstakingly, scholars learned to read cuneiform again, cracked the code of a language that had been silent for 2,000 years. The tablets spoke again, not in temples, not in ziggurats, but in museums, in universities, in publications that circulated worldwide. The Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, the King Lists, all of it emerging from darkness into light, available to be read, studied, debated, preserved, now not just in clay but in translations, in photographs, in digital archives, that ensure the knowledge will never be entirely lost again. And still today, even now, new tablets are discovered, new excavations uncover sealed rooms, new translations refine our understanding. The work continues. Archaeologists in Iraq, despite wars and conflicts and political instability, still dig, still preserve, still protect what remains of humanity's oldest written records. Even now, scholars debate what these texts mean, whether they're mythology or history, whether the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or memories of an earlier civilization or pure invention. The debate itself is part of the legacy, the continued engagement with questions that have no easy answers, the willingness to wonder, to question, to remain open to possibilities. The same stars that shone over Uruk, over Babylon, over the ziggurats, where priests watch the heavens, those stars still shine, unchanged. The constellations the Sumerians named Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, still wheel through the sky on the same paths. The planets the Babylonians tracked, Jupiter and Saturn, still orbit as they did then. The patterns remain, the cycles continue, and we continue, still watching the sky, still wondering what's out there, still building structures that reach upward, still mining the earth for resources we need, still organizing into civilizations that rise and grow complex, and eventually, inevitably, fall, still preserving knowledge against the darkness, still passing stories from generation to generation about where we came from and who we are. Perhaps that's the deepest legacy, not the mathematics or astronomy or architectural techniques, not the systems of writing or law or governance, but the pattern itself, the drive to know, to build, to reach beyond what seems possible, to wonder about our origins, to look at the stars and ask if we're alone, to dig in the earth and uncover our own past, to preserve memory against forgetting. The Anunnaki, whether gods or aliens or memories or myths, left us asking, left us wondering, left us with questions that may never be fully answered, but that drive us forward nonetheless, left us, perhaps, exactly what we needed, not answers, but the hunger for answers, not certainty, but the ability to live with uncertainty and keep searching anyway. The tablets rest in museums now, temperature-controlled, protected, available to anyone who wants to study them. The words pressed into clay by scribes who died 4,000 years ago, those words are still readable, still asking us to consider, still preserving whatever truth their authors believed was worth recording. And in some strange way, across all that time, across all those miles, across the gulf between their world and ours, a connection remains. We're reading their words, considering their questions, engaging with their mysteries. They spoke into the future, and we're listening. They preserved memory, and we're remembering. The story doesn't end, it changes, transforms, moves from one form to another, from oral tradition to written tablet, from buried archive to museum collection, from ancient cuneiform to modern translation, from historical account to mythological interpretation to speculative reconstruction. But it doesn't end, it continues, in us, in anyone who looks at the night sky and wonders, in anyone who reads these ancient texts and asks what they really mean, in anyone who stands before a ziggurat's ruins and imagines what it was like when it stood complete, when priests climbed those stairs, when something might have descended from above to meet them. The legacy isn't in stone or clay, or even in knowledge preserved. The legacy is in the question itself, the eternal human question. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? What happened before? What's still to come? The Anunnaki, whoever they were, whatever they were, left us that question. And perhaps that's the most valuable gift any teacher, any parent, any creator could leave. Not the answer, but the question, and the freedom, the responsibility, the beautiful burden of seeking answers for ourselves. The stars turn overhead, time moves on, but the question remains, and so do we, still asking, still wondering, still searching, just as perhaps we were meant to. And here we are, back in the present moment, back in the quiet of whatever night surrounds you now. The story we've traced tonight, from ancient Mesopotamia, through creation myths and flood accounts and mining operations and mysterious departures, that story rests now, settles into the silence it emerged from, returns to the clay tablets that have held it patiently for 4,000 years, waiting for readers, waiting for listeners, waiting for anyone willing to wonder. The same stars that shone over Uruk shine overhead tonight. Perhaps you can't see them where you are, perhaps city lights obscure them, or clouds, or the roof above you, but they're there, unchanged, following the same paths they followed when Sumerian priests climbed ziggurats to watch them, when Babylonian astronomers tracked their movements, when, if the tablets are true, the Anunnaki themselves looked up from Earth and saw home, or remembered home, or watched for something that might be following. The stars don't care about our questions. They shine with the same patient indifference they've always shown. They witnessed everything, or they witnessed nothing, and they offer no clarity either way. Just light, just presence, just the endless turning of cosmic time that makes human history, all of it, seem like a single breath in an endless meditation. The clay tablets rest in museums, in Baghdad, in London, in collections scattered across the world. The cuneiform pressed into them remains sharp, still readable, still asking us to decide what we're reading, history or mythology, memory or invention, truth or story, or perhaps, as is so often the case, some combination of all of these that defies easy categorization. We may never know with certainty whether the Anunnaki were real, whether they created humanity, whether they came from Nibiru or Mars or somewhere we can't imagine, whether they were running from catastrophe or war, or something that has no name in any human language, whether they departed because their work was done, or because they were forced to leave, or because staying was no longer possible. The mystery endures, patient as the stone, silent as the spaces between stars, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is part of what makes us human, what keeps us curious, what drives us to dig in the earth and watch the sky, and wonder about our place in patterns larger than we can fully comprehend. Take a breath. There's no rush. There never was. Somewhere in Iraq, the ruins of Uruk still stand, partially excavated, partially buried, the ziggurat reduced to its base, the great walls weathered by millennia, but present, still there, still marking the place where something remarkable happened, whether that something was divine intervention, or human achievement, or some combination we don't have language for yet. The wind moves over those ruins tonight, the same wind that moved over them when the city was alive, when priests climbed those stairs, when workers dug those canals, when scribes pressed symbols into wet clay and created humanity's first written words. The wind doesn't distinguish between then and now, between occupied and abandoned, between mystery and memory. It just moves, patient, endless, carrying whatever stories the desert chooses to release, and perhaps, in some way that transcends time and distance and the limitations of human understanding, the Anunnaki are still here. Not physically, not visibly, but in the questions they left behind, in the knowledge they shared or that we discovered ourselves, in the hunger to understand our origins, in the drive to reach beyond Earth, to touch other worlds, to become more than we currently are. Perhaps that's their legacy, not buildings or tablets or genetic manipulation, but the question itself, the eternal wondering, the beautiful burden of consciousness that asks where it came from and refuses to accept simple answers. The night deepens around you. Your breath slows. The story settles into whatever space you've made for it, joining all the other stories you carry, all the other mysteries you hold, and maybe tomorrow you'll think about it. Maybe you'll research more. Maybe you'll look at the stars and wonder what's out there. Maybe you'll visit a museum and stand before clay tablets and feel the weight of time that they represent. Or maybe you'll simply rest. Let the mystery be mysterious. Let the ancient world keep its secrets. Let the questions remain questions without the pressure of needing answers. Either way, the story continues. Not in grand revelations or final conclusions, but in the quiet persistence of wonder, in clay that holds memory, in stars that hold vigil, in ruins that hold space for what once was and might one day be again. The Anunnaki came, or didn't, created us, or we created ourselves, departed, or never arrived in the first place. And the truth, whatever it is, waits in the silence between certainty and doubt, between what we can prove and what we can imagine, between the light of stars and the darkness between them. Rest now. The ancient world doesn't need your worry. The tablets don't need your certainty. The mystery doesn't need solving tonight, or ever. It's enough to have wondered, to have listened, to have made space for questions that span millennia. Somewhere, the wind moves over buried cities, the stars wheel through their ancient paths, the clay remembers what it was told to remember, and time, patient time, continues its slow work of revealing and concealing, showing and hiding, offering glimpses without ever quite opening the door completely. If this resonated, there's more waiting. Subscribe, share and like for more ancient places, more mysteries carved in stone, more nights of wondering together what our ancestors left behind. Let's keep listening, and comment below, from where are you watching? And that's enough. That's always been enough. The stillness holds everything. The questions, the fragments, the possibilities, the wonder, and you, here, now, connected across time to everyone who's ever looked at stars and asked why. The night breathes, the mystery remains, and somewhere, always, something remembers.